This episode of Nos Audietis is sponsored by Full Pull Wines, a Seattle-based wine retailer and proud sponsor of Nos Audietis since 2011. Full Pull was founded in 2009, is based in Seattle, and is owned and operated by longtime Sounders supporters. They offer the best boutique wines of the world to members of their mailing list, with special focus on their home, the Pacific Northwest.
Hi, I'm Will Bruin, and I was just recognized as a Seattle Sounders legend. Now I get to do voice reads for the Sounder at Heart podcast network.
Here we go. Come on! Hey, O'Shan! Let's go!
A save by Fry! The Seattle Sounders have done it! MLS Cup winners!
Here comes Rangers through the middle to crown it for Seattle! And now they truly can start the celebrations. It's the Sounders MLS Cup.
Nico Ladero leaves absolutely no doubt! The Sounders rule the region!
Seattle Sounders is campeón!
It's gone! It's gone! Finally!
This feels fucking awesome.
This is a tiny dog.
We want to win. It's Seattle Sounders, bro.
Porter says cheated.
What was the thought process in terms of who you decided to use and who you didn't?
Ever since Sounder Carr wrote a commentary that we didn't take Open Cup seriously.
Welcome to another episode of Nos Audietis, sponsored by Full Pull Wines and our subscribers. We're recording on Wednesday, September 11th, 2024. I am your host, Jeremiah O'Shan. I am joined by my co-host, Aaron Campo, as well as our engineer, Lickett. This roller coaster season doesn't seem to be settling down anytime soon, and this week may have been one of the weirdest yet. I think most of us assumed a trip to Columbus was going to be a loss, regardless of how many players the crew were missing. What I don't think we factored in, though, was the crew were down to their fourth choice goalkeeper and didn't even bother to field a backup. That turned out to be a pretty big deal, as Abraham Romero got red carded in the first half stoppage time, and center back Sean Zawadzki strapped on the gloves, who the Sounders ended up torching for 4 goals. It should be said, all 4 of those goals were well taken, and it's entirely possible that even a quality goalkeeper wouldn't have stopped more than 1 or 2. Still, that ends up being the biggest narrative after the game, fairly or not. Aaron, what were your takeaways from a week that, in a sense, very important, but in another sense, I don't know, is there anything to take away?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's difficult. I think that you can take away the fact that they got gifted an easy 3 points and they took an easy 3 points, right? There are definitely times earlier in the season where I wouldn't have assumed things were going to turn out the way they did. It's tough to learn a lot of lessons. It's tough to say, I feel great about this team because of this, or anything like that, where I think a 4-0 win without the extenuating circumstances, obviously, I think has to change a lot of how you feel about the team, coming off a couple of tough losses, especially. But, it's they moved some things around. They had a different look. Christian Roldan played in the middle and I thought looked really good, which is encouraging because I think he's going to need to play there regularly for the rest of this year. And I think ideally the Sounders would like him to play there next year. And so I think, that's encouraging to see him perform well there. And, a lot has been made of the players the crew were missing. And there were quite a few of them, obviously, but it's not like they were playing crew 2,
Right. No, they had at least 7 of their legit starters in this game.
Right. And I don't think it was a situation where the keeper explained everything else about the game. I thought the Sounders actually looked quite good before the red card, especially, as they settled into the game. And yeah, so I think the extenuating circumstances, my main takeaway, the extenuating circumstances make it impossible for me to say, I feel really good about this result. I think that the team has got things turned around. I'm taking nothing but positives from it. But it also, I think it's okay to feel good about that win, right? It's okay to think they played well. And again, if you've got an opponent that's on the ropes, knock them out, right?
I think that's the big takeaway, right? Like, this was the big moment of this game really was the free kick from Albert Rusnak, which came immediately after the red card to Romero. And, I was just thinking, just put it on frame, force this guy to make a save. He does better than that. I mean, he buries it in the inside netting. It was a great free kick. Maybe the wall wasn't set up great, but honestly, I haven't seen a clear enough replay to be able to criticize the wall setup.
Right.
And then the other goals were they're all well taken. Who knows? I mean, you can never know for sure. I mean, I think more of the Sounders' attack was predicated on facing a 10-man opponent, which, hey, this happens. This is soccer. Like the Sounders have had struggles down a man as well. So I don't take anything away from them for doing all that. But let's, I don't want to spend too much time on those extenuating circumstances. But there is, it's been gone over. I would suggest that if you really want a thorough rundown of what happened, either read the story that I put on Sounder at Heart about it. If you want a less biased version of that story, you could listen to Extra Time, the MLS podcast. Andrew Wiebe actually did a really good job of explaining the ins and outs of it. But I want to kind of pick up on where Andrew left off a little bit. And I don't want to go through the whole scenario, but as you probably know, the Crew didn't have a backup goalkeeper, basically because they decided not to have one. They effectively said, we are too good to bring up someone who we don't fully trust to sit on our bench in case of emergency. And they got burned by it. And what I thought was this is the part where I want to get in. The part I found a little bit much was, their PR sort of machine has been rolling, and they've really wanted everyone to understand that they were standing on principle, that they didn't want to sign any of these two kids from MLS Next Pro because they weren't ready yet. They thought that would send the wrong message. They didn't want to bring up some random off the street because that person doesn't fit their culture. That person doesn't know their culture, whatever. Okay, fine. You want to stick by your principles. So if you want to stick by your principles, so part of that is accepting the ramifications of standing on those principles.
Yeah.
And if you want to stand on your principles, I think you also owe it to yourself to sit up there in front of the press and say, we wanted to do one thing, MLS wouldn't let us do it, and we were willing to take the punishment, which was essentially not having a backup goalkeeper, and we'll accept that punishment. We think the rule's wrong, we want to change it, all that, but this was the price that we are willing to pay, and we were willing to pay it. And instead, they concocted this whole story about how MLS made them CONCACAF made them put two goalkeepers on the bench during CONCACAF Champions Cup, which is not true. They concocted this idea of them having to burn a call-up on a friendly when they definitely could have used an Olympic call-up for that one, or they could have just picked up some random off the street to sit on the bench for Aston Villa. And so they created this whole narrative around being a victim that I just think is a little bit much. And yeah, I realize that Sounders fans come off as if we're maybe just, dancing on their grave or being sore winners or whatever. But I think the thing that kills me is that they're out there pushing this false narrative that I feel like if I'm not out there, frankly, combating it, then who else is?
Right. Yeah, it's ridiculous, man. And look, the Crew started this shit.
Right.
None of us cared about the Crew, and they wanted to be rivals, and they wanted there to be all this bad blood, and they got it to the point where yes, we hate them now. I hate the Crew. I hate their fans. I think they're the most annoying fan base in MLS. So hey, you got what you wanted. So yeah, we're gonna make fun of you for it. And if the position they were taking was, look, we took some risks. We kind of goofed up with the way we managed our roster, but it's really kind of ridiculous and petty and overly pedantic that MLS wasn't willing to work with us on this because we had players that qualified. And I'm annoyed as a Crew fan or as, somebody in the front office or whoever. I'm annoyed that they wouldn't work with us on this. I think it's ridiculous. Yeah. That's a totally fair position, right? But there is a conspiracy to give Messi the supporter shield so he can play in the Club World Cup. And this is the way This specific circumstance is how Don Garber personally has decided to ruin our season. He's the one that made the goalkeeper come out and try to make a save that would have been a borderline red card in the box. He's the one that made them use a loan on a cash grab friendly. He's the one that didn't understand the CONCACAF Champions Cup and Leagues Cup rules.
Right.
No, you messed up. You messed up. And like, yeah, you got caught on a technicality. And if I were a Sounders fan and the same thing had happened to us, I would probably be pissed at MLS for not working with the team and sort of
But also don't you think we would have worked up a little bit more frustration with the front office for botching
yeah, I would be super pissed at the front office for
I talked to
yeah.
I don't want to oversell this, but I talked to representatives, high up representatives from 3 different MLS teams. All of them laughed at the idea that they would ever allow their coach to take the field without a backup coach. They just thought it was an absurd thing.
Yeah.
And I can't make this point clearly enough. A lot of people have said, well, what happened to the MLS pool keeper? Couldn't they have just called up this pool keeper? Well, they got rid of the pool keeper a few years ago. I think there may have been pool keepers that had contracts that were running all the way through last year. But the part of the reason they don't have a pool goalkeeper is because there's no need for a pool goalkeeper, because teams have access to 5 or 6. Every team has access to 5 or 6 goalkeepers within their organization. And if they run out of goalkeepers in their organization, they have the ability to just go sign a keeper off the street. They can. Yeah. There are plenty of goalkeepers that are out of work that if you give them a week to show up, they will show up. I assure you.
Yeah.
I heard a story that for all the principal talk, this is the funniest thing. This is unconfirmed, so I don't want to make it sound like this is like truth. But my understanding is that 3 hours before kickoff, the crew were trying, like, all of a sudden came to their senses and were like, we have a goalkeeper in Cleveland. We think we can get him here in time. And the league was like, well, what are you doing?
Yeah.
You cannot, yeah. We cannot do that. That is not a thing.
So many outs. And look, have I been in a situation where a bunch of stuff had to go wrong for me to end up in a really bad situation and try to make it everybody else's fault? Absolutely. But yeah, I'm a loser. I'm a total loser. And I'm just a guy, right? I'm not a professional soccer team. And in hindsight, and pretty quickly in hindsight, I was always embarrassed in those situations because I realized, man, I looked like a real asshole.
Yeah.
Because everything that happened was my fault. And it could have been avoided at any number of turns.
Right.
And I didn't do anything to avoid it because I was being reckless or
lazy
or whatever. Or lazy. Usually lazy in my case.
Right.
I think.
Yeah. I mean, that's usually but maybe Ubris got the best of you.
Right.
But whatever. I don't
just
know.
the bargaining afterwards to try to make this about your principles as a club.
Right. Yeah.
These kids haven't earned it. We don't want to bring in a guy who doesn't understand our culture.
Yeah, exactly.
Like, how fragile is your culture that some guy who knows he is a rent-a-player is going to screw things up?
Yeah. Yeah. It's very silly. And I feel bad, honestly, like still talking about this 5 days later or whatever it is now. But I did feel like that was an important aspect of this that needed to be on the record, that like the principal stuff is it's like a nice idea. And I would have totally respected them if they had come out and been like, look, this is how we feel. This is how we run our organization. We weren't going to sacrifice our principles because we think the rule that MLS has here is stupid. And we think that MLS messed up by not letting us do that. Yeah. And all these kind of things. But we will take, that's how principled we are. We will take our medicine. Nope. There was none of that. There was not even a little bit. They made up whole like narrative. They concocted stuff from thin air. Also, the whole thing about I can't believe they made us play on an international date. I cannot tell you, like, this is the truth. There is not there is not a open weekday or midweek date or weekend date between June 1st, which when this game was originally scheduled, and the end of the season. There is because of Leagues Cup, there is no way to avoid conflict. Like they had this was you either plan an international date or I don't know what the alternative is. Like,
yeah, and it is stupid, right? We've been complaining about this for years in MLS.
Sure.
But the Sounders were missing guys too.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that also kind of got downplayed quite a lot. Like, oh, they were already down. They were missing the same number of starters. That's the truth. Now the Sounders had their actual backup goalkeeper and not their fourth string goalkeeper. So like advantage to the Sounders, but I don't know that that's like,
right.
Like, what are we're kind of like slicing things a little thin here. But all right, well, let's talk about the game a little bit more. Albert Rusnak was on a heater. This was maybe a game that was perfectly set up for him. He's now sitting on 18 goal contributions this year. Either that's primary assists or goals he's actually scored. He scored 2 goals off of free kicks. The funniest stat from this, he has attempted 6 shots from free kicks. He has 2 goals. That is probably a Messi-esque stat, right? Like I'm not actually comparing.
It's pretty insane. Yeah,
it's a pretty good ratio. 33% from 25 yards or whatever is pretty good.
Yeah, that's quite good. Yeah.
But yeah, this was a game. He looked great. He Sofa score gave him a perfect 10. You don't see that very often. It's the other thing that's kind of funny is that this week a bunch of different publications like MLS came out with a list of like their MVP candidate, their MVP favorites, and the podcast Soccer Wise had this long rundown of like their tiers of superstars, which I thought was actually kind of an interesting look. But one of the things I thought was really interesting, Albert Rusnak is like not even in the hint of the conversation for any of this stuff. And I'm not going to sit here and say he deserves to be an MVP or even an MVP candidate. I just think it's interesting because his stats are absolutely right. Like he's 11th in the league in goal contributions. That's pretty good.
It's
pretty good.
I think a lot of it gets downplayed because so many of them come off of free kicks, but free kicks count just as much as anything else.
Right.
Scoring a goal off a free kick counts the same as scoring a goal off an end-to-end 80 pass sequence. And that's something that the Sounders have not been able to do well, even during the best of times. They've very seldom been a good set piece team, and they are now. They're a very good set piece team from direct free kicks, from kicks into the box. They have some nice free kick routines. The stuff that we were bitching about, or at least I was bitching about nonstop early in the year, they seem to have figured a lot of that out. They seem to have realized that, hey, we can actually be pretty dangerous from these things if we get some routines together and all that kind of stuff. So yeah, I think Taylor Twellman was talking about this during the Portland game about how, and he was talking about Nico Ladero. He wasn't talking about Albert Rusnak, but he was saying that a lot of things that he did when he was here just got completely overlooked by the MLS media.
Yeah.
And that's just kind of generally true about teams that play on the West Coast if they're not playing in LA. Mm-hmm. And I think that's the case here. Like, I think a lot of people, if you ask them what kind of season he was having outside of Seattle, would tell you he's having a pretty mediocre season.
Mm-hmm.
Because that was the narrative early on in the year. And that narrative hasn't been corrected as there's been new information that's come to light. And I think that's unfortunate. I think Sounders fans underappreciate him to some degree and how well he's played and how much he's been able to contribute to this sort of resurgence. But I think even more so, the average MLS fan, MLS media in general, just doesn't really give him his due.
And I will admit that part of that, I mean, his obviously his stats look a lot better this week than they did last week, but he's been among the league leaders in primary assists essentially for the last couple months. He's having a very good season. Now, yes, his penchant for not contributing a lot in matches against LAFC particularly is not great, but I think that says more about the talent, the attack as a whole, than it does about Albert Rusnak or even Jordan Morris. Like, they just are not, this is not an attack that sets up well for LAFC in particular. But I do think it's worth pointing out that before the red card in this game, they look fine. They were limited. They were giving up a lot of possession to Columbus, but Columbus was not creating any danger at all. The best by far, the best chance of the game came on the Sounders' first shot, which didn't come until like the 30th minute. But the Sounders were doing a good job of sort of absorbing pressure and looking for counterattack opportunities. Paul Rothrock put in an absolutely perfect cross to Jordan. He hit it with, what's the funny thing is he had so much time. He probably could have hit it with his right, but he hit it with his left. He ends up hitting it wide. Rothrock ends up getting another good look for himself coming off the left wing. Those were the two best looks by far of the first half. And I did think that the Sounders deserved a little bit more credit on the play where they drew the red card, because that was part of a pattern that they were constantly testing the Crew back line with either through balls on the ground or balls over the top to Jordan. And they were kind of varying it up and making the Crew defend in different ways. And that it finally paid off. I think they deserve credit for that. I mean, it was, they were doing a good job of sort of looking for patterns that they thought were vulnerable.
Yeah, absolutely. I think that if their keeper gets sent off and they have an actual backup on the bench, I still think the Sounders romp in that game. Like, I think they're going to win that game comfortably at that point, because I think the Sounders were the better team up until that red card. And I think that they, like you said, really starting with after the half hour mark, they're really starting to create and look more comfortable and find good opportunities on the counter. And the best games the Sounders have played this year have looked a lot like that, where they sort of feel out the game, absorb a lot of pressure, let the other team have possession, find opportunities to turn up the heat on the press guys in the midfield, even guys as good as Darlington Nagbe, into giveaways, and look for those opportunities on the break and score goals. And that's they didn't score the goal on that directly off that breakaway, obviously, but I'd say getting the guy sent off and then scoring a goal on the free kick is probably even better.
I think that counts.
Yeah. So I think that's kind of been the blueprint for the best Sounders performances this year. And I think it was starting to kick into effect even before the red card. So that's I think the most encouraging thing is that you can't look at the red card, I think, reasonably and say, well, the Sounders were getting shithoused until that point, and they really got let off. They created the circumstances that led to the red card by playing their game that they've had a lot of success with over the last few months, and they took advantage of it. And I think anytime that play style can be reinforced to something that is successful, I'm extremely happy, because I think it's the best play style for the personnel. I've really liked how they've looked. They're probably not going to beat LAFC playing that way, but they're not going to beat them playing possession style either, right? So I'm just trying not to think of the entire year and everything that happens in terms of LAFC.
Admirable aim, I think.
Yeah, because it's just like, we've got 8 games left, or six games left. And then the playoffs, and we'll play LAFC at most one more time. So that's a lot of soccer that can still be fun.
I hate to break. There is a possibility we could play them 3 more times if we were to draw them in the first round of the playoffs.
Well, I guess that's true, but I don't. That seems unlikely to me. I guess
it feels unlikely, and let's just hope it doesn't happen.
Yeah, that would be really, really disheartening.
Thank you for listening to the Sounder at Heart Podcast Network, which now includes Nos Arietes, Lobbing Scorchers, and the Cooler Guild. We've been independent since August of 2023, but need your support to make sure it continues. Although this podcast is free, it's only made possible by your continued support. Memberships start as low as $25 a year, which not only helps make podcasts like this one happen, but also gets you access to everything we produce. If you're able to support us at higher levels, starting at $75 a year, you gain access to a host of other perks, most notably entry into our members-only Discord, where the smartest, funniest, and most engaged commenters share their thoughts and ideas. To find out more, just visit sounderatheart.com and click the subscribe button in the top right corner. Thanks for listening. Today, MLS released a a bracket, sort of like how the playoffs, if the playoffs started today. And I got to admit, I'll take it. I think the Sounders would match up with the Rapids in the 4-5 game. So they would have to go to Colorado twice. But I would say of the top four, that's the team that certainly of the top four teams, that's the team I would most want to play. But more importantly, the Sounders would be on the opposite side of the bracket from LAFC. So they would play the Galaxy. If they beat the Rapids, they would play the Galaxy in the Western Conference semifinals. I will take that. I will take that all day.
Yeah.
Like
yeah. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh yeah, that's all. I was just gonna say and they're also on the opposite side of RSL. I think in that scenario.
It would be.
So I mean, I would take. Honestly, I feel like finishing 5th, where you're on the opposite side of the bracket from LAFC, is preferable to finishing 3rd, where you're on the same side of the bracket as LAFC.
Yeah. And you'd have to play in Sandy twice, most likely.
Right. Exactly. So honestly, I feel like the way it's stacking up right now, the best case scenario might be for the Sounders to finish 4th.
Yeah.
Where you get home field advantage, and then you are on the same side of the bracket as, I don't know. I guess it depends on who wins the West, right? It's still a possibility that LAFC could pass the Galaxy, but the way it's stacking up right now, 4th looks like the ideal scenario. And the thing about this win over the Crew is that it sets up a scenario where the Sounders can get to 55 points without even getting a road result, but all 6 of their last games in the regular season are all winnable games. They're at home against Sporting Kansas City on Sunday, and then on Wednesday they host the Earthquakes. Those are huge games. They have to win those games.
Yeah.
But then they have the Dynamo, I believe, after that. And then they have 2 road games against Vancouver and Houston. Is that right?
Let me check.
No. They play Houston at home. They play Vancouver and Colorado.
Yep.
And then they're at home against the Timbers, which I don't relish that necessarily, but they are quite due at home against the Timbers.
Yeah.
But if all they do is win their home games, they're in great shape. They're in spectacular shape, frankly.
Yeah. If they win their home games, that's
55
12
points.
That's 12 points. Yeah.
Yeah, that's 12. It's going to be very funny. Unironically funny. It's just funny. If they get to 55 points with all the teeth gnashing and frustration that this season has been filled with.
Yeah.
For them to finish on 55 points, which is by their standard, actually a pretty good season. I think it's probably better than a median season for them.
Yeah.
Would be very funny.
It would be very funny. It would be very reminiscent of 2018, I think.
Yeah.
But funnier because they didn't do the thing that everybody was begging for them to do this year, and they did in 2018.
Right.
And that turned around their season, and this year they just got healthy and kind of turned around their season that way. But it would be very funny. I would take it. It would be better than last year. A year they finished second in the West, right?
Yeah.
Which, can't ask for much more than that. Well, you can. You can't reasonably ask for much more than that, given the actual circumstances that we're faced with. And I think it's possible they get 14 points, something like that, out of these games. I think that's. I
don't think 14 points is a high. I would say that's the high expectation, or the 95th percentile.
That's as many points as they're plausibly going to get.
Right. I would say you're right. Exactly.
Yeah. They could win.
I would say it's within the realm of possibility.
Right. Yeah. And that would put them on 57, right?
That would put on 57 points, which would be pretty amazing.
Pretty good. Yeah, pretty good.
Of course, if they were to do that, somehow they'd end up getting drawn against LAFC in the first round, and that would be somehow a disaster. But one of the other things that I thought was funny this week is, so I just wrote a rather long post where I talked to a bunch of different people about Georgie Monongu, who is a absolutely fascinating character. This is a guy, he came from the Ivory Coast, came to Defiance at 19, sort of wowed everyone with his athleticism, looked like he might make the first team in 2023. Turns out he has this eye issue. doctors go in, they look at his eye, and then they're like, "Oh, you actually have been blind in this eye for a long time." He kind of powers through that, and he's not someone that has necessarily a huge end product at this point, but I think if you watch him, you see it's not hard to see what a talent he is. I mean, he is almost unstoppable on the dribble. He picked up an assist against the Crew, and he looked great against the Timbers. And this is a player who, if the Sounders had signed off of a $2 million transfer, people would be over the moon excited about his potential.
Yeah.
And he's now on the first team. I'm not going to sit here and say he's going to be the game changer, but he's got that kind of talent. At the same time, Braudelia Rodriguez, a player who justifiably we had completely forgotten about. I hadn't really thought about much at all. But then I don't know if you had a chance to watch him. He played 20 minutes for the Defiance. This is his second appearance of the season because he's been battling injuries. The last time he played, he got hurt, and then he was on the shelf again. But anyway, he looks like he's healthy again. He played 20 minutes against the Timbers 2. He had 2 goals and an assist. And I say this without hyperbole. He easily could have scored a hat trick and had another assist with just like a slightly different luck. He was absolutely dominant. I'm not going to sit here and say that he is going to do anything for the MLS season, but I was reminded of what a talent this guy is. And there is a possibility that the Sounders essentially over the last month will have added Pedro de la Vega, Georgie Monongu, and Braudelia Rodriguez, all of whom are at the very least high upside potential players.
Yeah.
Who knows what they'll do? And I'm not trying to like retcon the transfer window. We both agreed they should have signed someone. I think it's a mistake that they didn't sign someone. But there is something to be said about them bringing in these 3 players at right around the time of the transfer window closing. And they could be they could be impact players on this team.
Yeah, absolutely. I think Braudelio is such a wait and see for me. And I think for everybody reasonably.
He's never played against MLS opponents. That's the reality.
But he's super exciting, obviously. Yeah. And it's always nice to have somebody playing with Defiance that has that sort of must-see potential. Kind of like Willie Won't He breakout kind of potential. That makes the team fun to follow. It gives you something to be excited about. Georgie Monongu is a guy who I think a lot of people were skeptical, rightfully so, about his ability to translate to MLS. I take your point and totally agree that if he had been a guy we'd signed for a couple $1 million in the transfer window, he comes in and does this, that we would be really more excited. But I think a lot of that is that we have a lot of evidence of what he can do at Next Pro, which is a much lower level. However, I think he is the kind of player and has the kind of skill set that can sort of weirdly translate better to a higher level, because he doesn't have to be the guy who is dribbling guys and creating the chance or scoring the goal. He just has to be the guy that can dribble the guy and put the ball into a dangerous area.
Right.
He doesn't have to pick out pinpoint passes, because there are other high-level players that can get to balls that guys at Defiance might not be able to, et cetera, and so forth. He doesn't have to be the guy, the focal point of a team, the way he kind of does at a lower level.
Mm-hmm.
And so I think that his ability to do something that nobody else on the team really can, right? Like Pedro can beat guys off the dribble. He cannot beat guys off the dribble and just totally scorch them the way that Georgie can, right?
Yeah,
like he's not
overpowering. Like Monongu really has the potential to overpower defenders. At his best, Pedro de la Vega is not going to do that.
No, absolutely not. Absolutely not. And that's fine. That's not a knock on Pedro. It's just they're totally different players with one thing in common, and that's their ability to beat guys on the dribble. And I think having guys that can beat you in totally different ways is such an underrated thing to have in your arsenal. To have a guy that can beat you playing super direct like Monongu, to have a guy that can beat you like De La Vega can by creating space with a dribble and then finding a killer pass. Having a guy like Jordan who probably isn't going to beat you off the dribble, but is straight up going to run right over you or past you. Those are all really, really useful things to have at your disposal. And, I don't want to get ahead of myself with Georgie, but I'm a lot more excited about him now than I was when he signed. And I always did have this kind of, what if the stuff he does is more valuable for the Sounders than it was for Defiance? And I'm starting to feel that way.
And I think in the small sample size of when we've seen him play against MLS opponents, he looked. I think we saw it big time against the Timbers. I think we saw it a little bit against LAFC in the Open Cup, where he did help create a couple chances. We definitely saw it against RSL in that start earlier this season. So I think you're right that there's something to be said about, and this was something that actually Wade Weber had said to me. I didn't get it into the story, but he did talk about that exact thing, where this is a player who somewhat countered. Yes, the defenders are better in MLS, so that counteracts it some, but the players he's passing it to are so much better than the players that he's passing it to at the MLS Next Pro level that he doesn't need to, he's got a bigger target to hit, essentially, because the defenders, at least on a 1v1 basis, don't seem any more capable of stopping him at the MLS level than they are at the MLS Next Pro level. And they also aren't going to have as much freedom to double team him. They aren't going to have as much freedom to lose focus of the other attackers on the field. So I do think he has the potential to be potentially a real game changer. The other thing that came out of this game that I do think is valuable is João Paulo didn't play. It turns out he has a calf injury and he's probably going to miss 2 to 3 weeks. But I thought this was the best that we've seen a João Paulo-less defensive midfield look so far this year. And that was Josh Atencio and Christian Roldan. Christian Roldan, I don't think it's hyperbole to say this is the best he's looked. I thought he looked really, really good.
Yeah, he was great. He was really great. I've obviously, I think pretty famously, as famously as this opinion can be, been of the opinion that Christian's best position is right back. And I still might think that, but I think a lot of that was based on just the assumption that he wasn't going to get moved back to the midfield.
Yeah.
If they're willing to play him there and he can play like that, I'm all for it. It creates a little bit of an issue because I feel like there is pressure to play Obed Vargas.
Yeah, there is. I think you're right.
Yeah, that is not just related to what he can do on the field. And he's been great this year, right? Like I don't want to make it sound like I don't think he's earned his playing time, because he has. But I don't know that a Christian Obed midfield is going to play the way that one did. We're probably going to find out, right?
At some point, I think you're right. I think those are valid. I think he and Josh are a particularly good combo, in part because they both do such a good job of covering ground, and they sort of complement each other a little bit better. I think you're right, than an Obed and Christian potentially complement each other.
Right. It would be interesting to see Obed on the right again, I think.
I mean, there's ways to get Obed on the field regardless. I agree with you. And who knows? I mean, it might be for like right now where we are. Maybe Obed only plays if João Paulo is or maybe only starts. I don't know. I don't think it's that crazy, frankly. He's not sitting for bad players. If in that case, he would be sitting for, like, Atencio was an Olympic player. He's a very, very good player that unfortunately we've not got a lot of opportunities to see him with consistent runs of games because he keeps getting hurt, or there's something that sidetracks him. But I would love to see him get 5 or 6 games in a row. And if that's Christian Roldan playing every game, I'm okay with that. I think either way, we're going to see a couple different pairings this week because it's too easy to not rotate for the Wednesday game against San Jose. But it's a good problem to have. I'll say that.
Yeah, it absolutely is. And I mean, I think everybody knows Obed's probably going to be gone at some point next year, right? So
Yeah.
If everything goes according to plan, I think it's kind of a negative if he's not, for everybody involved. But so they've got to prepare for that succession plan kind of at some point, right? And
and I think we probably want to see a Obed Christian pairing at some point anyway. I'm actually curious. I'm looking at if they've actually played together this year. They have one start together, and that was a game they won. It was the St. Louis game, I guess, at home against St. Louis.
They played pretty well
good in that game, I guess.
If I recall. So maybe it's not a huge problem at all. But I think that if that's going to be the midfield for, let's say, mid-season and the next few years beyond that, I'm not going to say I'm super excited and feel great about everything based on one game, but that certainly gave me plenty of reason to be optimistic.
Yeah. I mean, yeah, exactly. And I think that's the thing that it's unfair to totally discount this game because of the way the second half played out.
Yeah.
There was plenty in the first half to be able to get excited about what happened, to not feel guilty about the second half, but to still take something away from the game. Like, I don't think that the Sounders aren't going to face anyone that's more talented than the front 10, let's say, for the Crew in this game.
Yeah, I think that's true. I think there aren't teams in MLS outside of LAFC, obviously, and probably Miami, that I don't think the Sounders can beat.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I guess this is what's tough though, and I think the Sounders front office knows this, and so I feel like this message isn't going to get lost. But what's frustrating is, on their day, the Sounders can beat anybody. Like, that's MLS, right? That's if everything goes their way. Yes, even LAFC is beatable for the Sounders.
Yeah.
But the thing is that everything has to go their way to beat they are not a top 5 team on talent. I think we can admit that.
Yeah, they're not.
They are probably they are somewhere between 6th and 10th best in the league on talent, I think. And I think that's pretty fair. And in a sense, that's not a horrible place to be, but it's also just not the standard that the Sounders have set for themselves.
No, I think it's the difference between if the Sounders go to play LAFC or go to play the Galaxy in Carson in a 1-game playoff, I'm going to think we've got a shot at this.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not going to think we're going to win this game.
Yeah.
You know what I mean? And that's a big difference. It is. Yeah. It's nice to be the underdog, I guess, when you succeed. That feels great. Beating LAFC in 2019 in LA, one of the happiest moments of my sports fandom, not just Sounders fandom, but sports fandom. It's a great feeling when it comes off, but it gets stale after a while, especially when, you've got a boogeyman like LAFC. You want to feel like not only can you beat any team in the league, but you expect to beat most of the teams in the league, right? And that doesn't mean you're going to win 34 games, obviously, but it means any given game you're going to go in thinking like, I expect to win this game outside of, the 4 or 5 toughest games on your schedule, right? And when you don't win those games, it's a disappointment. And the Sounders have been there before. And I think we've talked about this a lot. There are some people in this fan base that feel like the Sounders need a total rebuild to be competitive, that they need to gut the roster. I don't feel that way at all. I think
this last week illustrated that too.
Absolutely. I think that if this team can be in consideration for, getting into the top 3 in the West potentially, they're almost certainly going to make the playoffs in a decent-ish spot, right? 3, 4, 5, 6, somewhere in there.
Yeah.
they're going to end up with a respectable number of points, and they're going to do that with an awful start.
Yeah.
And with functionally two open DP spots for most of the season.
Or play without two DPs. Yeah.
Right. That's a good foundation to build off of. That's a really solid foundation to build off of. You don't need to add a ton to that, but you do have to get those difference makers. That's the key thing.
And I think that it's easy to forget that the gap between how good your roster looks and how good your roster could be is oftentimes pretty small.
Yeah.
And it is defined by one or two, three players. And if you just look at the teams that have three functional DPs versus the teams that have one or two, and that's really what is making the difference for the most part in this league. And if you can get those right, you're golden. If the Sounders go out and if their DPs next year are Pedro de la Vega, Albert Rusnak, and a banger of a offensive player, I think this is an MLS Cup contender probably. If they don't do that, they're probably right back where they are now, and that's the reality.
Yeah, that's the difference between the elite teams and the unions or the dynamos to some degree, right? Where they're usually pretty good. They'll have a year or two occasionally where they just hit on a signing and get some good luck and play really well, and they're elite for that season, or at least very, very good for that season, and then they're right back to where they were. And that's in a lot of ways the worst that you can be, the worst thing you can be. And
it's really frustrating to be right there, but not over the top.
Right. And not to come back to 2018 constantly, but in the summer window of that year, the Sounders, going into that window, one of the worst teams in the league, looked like Brian Schmetzer was probably going to be shown the door. Really bad situation. They signed Raul Ruiz-Diaz and Brad Smith. They win a ton of games in a row. They go into the playoffs looking like an MLS Cup contender. Things have changed in the league since then, but they haven't changed that much. And it just shows what adding one or two impact guys can do for a team.
Yeah, absolutely. Did they also sign Leardom that year? Or was he 17?
He was 17. Yeah, he was 17. They signed Kim Kee-hee and
Wayne that was in the offseason, right?
That was in the offseason, yeah.
Yeah,
and Magnus Wolf-Eichram too.
Yeah, that's right. Oh, Magnus.
Yeah.
Well, that's probably a good place to call this. So thanks for hanging out with us. If you are interested, we'd love to have you as a subscriber to the Sounder at Heart podcast network and the Sounder at Heart website. We are in the process of putting all of our podcasts onto one service, and hopefully we'll create a more easily followed unified feed. In addition to this feed, you won't hopefully have to do much different, but we'll have more information on that pretty soon. I will note that if you were a subscriber to the $19 a year tier, that is no longer a tier. And I guess a lot of people are getting payment failed notices when they try to renew at the $19 rate. All you need to do is just go onto the site, click on your account button, and it'll give you all the new rate options. So I apologize if you were really hoping to keep that $19 rate forever, but it's now $25. So hopefully you still think that's a good value. All that said, thanks to our sponsor, Full Pull Wines. Thank you to our subscribers. You guys are making this possible. Thanks to Lick It for producing the show. I'm Jeremiah Shan signing off for Aaron Campo. This is No Study at This. Remember, you'll never get alone.
of you. Let's win another one.